Dearest listeners, there exists in the annals of the ton no greater paradox than this: that society, which prides itself on recognizing true breeding, so often mistakes a diamond for common glass when that jewel is covered in the dust of misfortune. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a lady who lost everything save her dignity, and a Marquess who saw what others refused to acknowledge. But let us not rush through the delicate unfurling of this remarkable story, for the best tales, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly, allowing each layer of complexity to reveal itself in its own time. The season of 1812 had brought with it the usual parade of hopeful debutantes and calculating mamas, the endless round of balls and musicales that marked London society's most fashionable months. Yet amidst the swirl of silks and the glitter of candlelight in drawing rooms across Mayfair, there existed a shadow world of those who served the great houses, who made possible the splendor that the aristocracy took as their natural right. It was in this twilight realm between stairs that Miss Belle Thornton had found herself residing for the past 2 years, a circumstance that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known her in her former life. The mansion of Sir Reginald and Lady Constance Hartley on Berkeley Square stood as a testament to new money attempting to purchase old respectability. Sir Reginald had made his fortune in trade, a fact whispered behind fans but never mentioned in his hearing, and had secured his baronetcy through judicious loans to a cash-strapped crown during the wars with Napoleon. His wife, the former Constance Bellingham, possessed impeccable lineage but negligible dowry, making their union a perfect mercenary arrangement that satisfied both parties' ambitions whilst leaving their hearts entirely untouched. Lady Constance had required a companion, someone to manage her correspondence, organize her social calendar, and provide the appearance of genteel company without the inconvenience of genuine friendship. She had found in Miss Belle Thornton a young woman of appropriate age and evident education, recommended through an employment agency that catered to the respectable poor. What Lady Constance did not know, what she could never have imagined, was that her deferential companion possessed breeding that far exceeded her own. Isabella Thornfield had been born to privilege as assured as sunrise. The Earl of Ashbourne's daughter had wanted for nothing in her childhood, educated by the finest governesses in French, Italian, and music, taught to move through society with the confidence of one born to command respect. Her father, the 8th Earl, had been a jovial man with an unfortunate weakness for trusting the wrong friends and an even more unfortunate tendency toward speculation in ventures he did not fully understand. The ruin, when it came, had been swift and absolute. A supposed friend, a certain Mr. Leonard Blackwell, had convinced the Earl to invest heavily in a South American mining operation that promised extraordinary returns. The entire scheme had been fraudulent from inception, designed to fleece wealthy investors of their capital. When the truth emerged, the Earl of Ashbourne found himself not merely impoverished, but deeply in debt. The shock proved too much for his constitution. He suffered an apoplectic fit within days of discovering the full extent of his losses and died without regaining consciousness. Isabella's mother, the gentle Lady Ashbourne, survived her husband by barely 6 months. Grief and social ostracism broke her spirit. She faded like a flower denied sunlight, leaving Isabella alone save for her younger brother Thomas, a boy of 14 forced to leave Harrow for a charity school in the north of England. Isabella watched as the world of her childhood was dismantled, piece by piece. The Ashbourne estates, the London house in Grosvenor Square, the hunting box in Leicestershire, all sold to satisfy creditors. The final indignity came when her mother's pianoforte, that instrument upon which Isabella had spent countless happy hours, was carried off by strangers who cared nothing for the music that had once filled their home. She was left with £43, the clothes on her back, and a choice that would determine the rest of her life. She could have thrown herself upon the mercy of distant relations, becoming an object of charity and pity in some country household. She could have sought a position as a governess, though her age of 21 made this problematic, and her lack of references from respectable families rendered it nearly impossible. Or she could do what she ultimately chose: assume a false identity and seek employment as a companion to a lady of the ton, hiding in plain sight among the very society that would have shunned her had they known her true circumstances. The logic had been sound. As Miss Belle Thornton, the surname chosen for its commonness, the given name a diminutive of her true Christian name, she could remain in London, close enough to visit Thomas during his school holidays. She could maintain her dignity by earning her keep honestly rather than living off charity. Most importantly, she could preserve what remained of the Thornfield name. If society discovered that Lady Isabella had been reduced to working as a servant, it would destroy any possibility of Thomas eventually reclaiming his place among the gentry. But if Lady Isabella simply disappeared, presumed to have retired to the continent or married quietly in the country, then perhaps her brother might one day restore their family's honor. The work itself had proven far more arduous than Isabella had anticipated. Lady Constance possessed a temperament as beautiful as her face was lovely, which was to say, not at all. She delighted in small cruelties, in asserting her dominance over someone she perceived as beneath her station. Morning calls required Isabella to stand silently in the corner, ready to fetch shawls or ring for tea, but never invited to sit. During the endless hours of selecting gowns and planning toilettes, Isabella was expected to offer opinions that matched perfectly with whatever Lady Constance had already decided, praising choices that sometimes bordered on the absurd. Yet it was the social events that proved most torturous. Isabella would accompany Lady Constance to balls and music halls, parties and assemblies, all the glittering entertainments she had once attended as an honored guest. Now she sat in the shadows, watching others dance, listening to conversations from which she was excluded by the rigid hierarchy that governed every interaction. She saw former acquaintances who would have cut her dead had they recognized her. Ladies who had once taken tea in her mother's drawing room, now sweeping past without a glance at the quiet companion in the corner. Isabella had developed an armor against the pain, a practiced stillness that allowed her to observe without feeling, to witness without remembering too much of what she had lost. She read voraciously during her few hours of leisure, borrowing volumes from the circulating library on her half-day each fortnight. She wrote weekly letters to Thomas, carefully cheerful missives that never mentioned her true circumstances, but instead painted a picture of a sister comfortably settled as a companion to a kind lady. She saved every possible shilling, hoarding her wages of £20 per annum against future need, dreaming of the day when she might have enough to help establish Thomas in some respectable profession. The season of 1814 had arrived with its usual fanfare, and with it came an increase in Lady Constance's social obligations. Sir Reginald had secured a coveted invitation to Almack's, that holiest of holies among London's assembly rooms, and Lady Constance had become obsessed with establishing herself among the highest circles of the ton. Every event became an opportunity to cultivate advantageous connections, to be seen, to climb another rung on the precarious ladder of social advancement. It was for this reason that Lady Constance had decided to host a musical soirée in late April. The evening would feature professional musicians, elaborate refreshments, and a carefully curated guest list designed to impress. Among those invited was Lord Adrian Sutherland, Marquess of Ravencrest, one of the most eligible and most elusive bachelors in all of England. The Marquess was a figure of considerable fascination among the ton. At 34 years of age, he possessed a fortune that placed him second only to the Duke of Devonshire in wealth among the English peerage. His father, the Duke of Northmore, remained in excellent health and showed no signs of relinquishing his earthly existence anytime soon, leaving Adrian with the courtesy title of Marquess and an independence secured by his late grandfather's careful settlements. But it was not his wealth that made Lord Adrian the subject of such intense speculation. It was his tragedy and his subsequent withdrawal from society. 4 years prior, his young wife of barely a year had died in childbed, taking their infant son with her into that undiscovered country from which no traveler returns. The grief had transformed him from a sociable young man, known for his charm and generous nature, into a remote figure who attended only the most obligatory social functions and showed no interest whatsoever in remarrying, despite the increasingly desperate attempts of matchmaking mamas to thrust their daughters into his path. His mother, the Dowager Duchess of Northmore, for the current Duke had remarried after his first wife's death, had grown increasingly concerned about her son's self-imposed isolation. She worried about his melancholy, about the way he had buried himself in managing his estates and expanding his already considerable art collection. She had begun a campaign to draw him back into society, using every maternal weapon in her considerable arsenal. It was the Dowager Duchess who had convinced her son to accept Lady Constance's invitation, pointing out that the musical program would include a performance by Signor Bartolomeo, a tenor newly arrived from Italy whose voice had been praised in the most glowing terms by those who had heard him at the opera house. Lord Adrian, whose patronage of the arts was well known, could hardly refuse such an inducement, particularly when presented with his mother's gentle but implacable insistence. The evening of the musical soirée arrived with perfect weather, the sort of mild spring night that seemed designed by Providence for elegant entertainments. The Hartley mansion glowed with candlelight from every window, and carriages deposited their fashionable occupants in a steady stream from 8 o'clock onward. Lady Constance had spared no expense, decorating the music room with elaborate arrangements of hothouse flowers whose heady perfume mingled with the scent of beeswax candles and expensive French perfumes. The air hummed with the murmur of refined conversation punctuated by the delicate clink of crystal champagne flutes, whilst the heat from dozens of bodies and hundreds of candles created an atmosphere at once stifling and intoxicating. The very essence of fashionable society compressed into gilded rooms. Isabella had spent the day in frantic preparation, running errands for her mistress with barely a moment to catch her breath. Lady Constance had changed her gown 3 times, each change requiring Isabella to rearrange jewels and adjust coiffure accordingly. By the time the first guests arrived, Isabella's feet ached abominably, and she longed for nothing more than her narrow bed in the servants' quarters. But the evening's duties had only just begun. Lady Constance had conceived a particular entertainment for her guests, one that filled Isabella with a dread she dared not show. After Signor Bartolomeo's performance, there would be a display of amateur talent, with several young ladies invited to demonstrate their accomplishments on the pianoforte. Lady Constance, who possessed no musical ability whatsoever, had decided that her companion would perform in her stead, a decision that simultaneously flattered her vanity, suggesting she kept only the most accomplished servants, and humiliated Isabella, reducing her to the status of an entertainer hired for the evening. The music room filled with London's elite. Isabella recognized many faces from her former life, though she kept her eyes downcast and her posture deferential. The Countess of Riverton swept past with barely a glance, the same woman who had once declared Isabella's mother the most elegant hostess in all of Mayfair. Lord and Lady Thornbury arrived with their daughters, girls who had attended the same dancing master as Isabella in what now seemed another lifetime. None of them spared a second look at the quiet companion arranging chairs in the corner. It was near 9 o'clock when Lord Adrian arrived, accompanied by his mother. The Dowager Duchess was a handsome woman in her 6th decade, her silver hair dressed in the latest fashion and her bearing one of absolute assurance. She greeted Lady Constance with the sort of polite warmth that great ladies extended to their inferiors, making it clear through subtle emphasis that she was conferring honor by her presence rather than receiving it. Lord Adrian himself proved a striking figure. He stood well over 6 feet in height, with dark hair showing traces of silver at the temples and eyes of such a deep gray they appeared almost black in certain lights. His features were aristocratic without being soft, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command, but not to cruelty. He wore his evening clothes with the careless elegance of one who had never needed to think about fashion, because it came naturally to him. There was about him an air of carefully controlled distance, as though he had erected invisible barriers between himself and the world. Isabella, arranging programs on a small table near the door, found herself inadvertently in his path as he entered. She stepped back quickly, eyes lowered in the manner of a proper servant, but not before she caught a glimpse of his profile. Something in the set of his jaw, in the barely perceptible sadness that lingered about his mouth, spoke to her own hidden grief. It was the look of someone who had learned to carry loss as one might carry a weight that could never be set down, only borne with as much grace as possible. The musical program began shortly thereafter. Signor Bartolomeo proved worthy of his reputation, his tenor voice soaring through arias from Mozart and Rossini with technical brilliance and genuine emotion. The audience listened with rapt attention, even the usually restless young ladies sitting quietly for once. Isabella stood in her designated corner, ostensibly supervising the servants who would provide refreshments during the interval, but in truth, simply trying to make herself invisible. During the interval, Lady Constance announced the amateur performances to follow. 3 young ladies would each perform a short piece, followed by her own contribution, which was, of course, to be performed by Miss Thornton. Isabella felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She had not played in company for 2 years, not since her father's ruin. Her fingers were no longer as nimble as they once had been, roughened by work that had nothing to do with music. But she had no choice in the matter. The first young lady, a Miss Henrietta Dalton, performed a simple sonata with more enthusiasm than skill. The second, Miss Caroline Rushworth, displayed better technique but no real feeling for the music. The third, Lady Elizabeth Montrose, daughter of an Earl, showed genuine talent in her rendering of a piece by Haydn. The applause for each was polite and measured, the sort that society gave to young ladies fulfilling expectations. Then Lady Constance announced, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, that her companion would perform a selection from Beethoven. The choice of composer was deliberate cruelty. Beethoven's works were considered challenging, demanding not just technical proficiency, but interpretive depth. To assign such a piece to a mere companion was to invite comparison, to demonstrate that Lady Constance possessed the sort of servant who could entertain on a level equal to the daughters of the aristocracy. Isabella rose from her corner and moved to the pianoforte with as much composure as she could muster. She was acutely aware of her position, of the anomaly she represented. Companions did not typically perform at such gatherings. Some guests looked puzzled, others vaguely uncomfortable, as though uncertain whether this was a novelty to be enjoyed or a breach of propriety to be quietly condemned. She seated herself at the instrument, adjusted her skirts, and placed her hands upon the keys. For a moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to remember who she had once been. The daughter of an Earl, accomplished in all the graces, playing for her own pleasure in her mother's music room. Then she began. The piece was Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique, a work she had learned years ago and practiced in secret during her precious moments of solitude. Her fingers found the keys with a sureness born of countless hours of practice in her youth. The opening grave poured forth, melancholy and powerful, each note struck with the weight of genuine emotion. The music filled the room, silencing the whispered conversations, demanding attention through its sheer intensity. Isabella lost herself in the performance. This was no mere display of technical skill, no attempt to impress through difficult passages executed with precision. This was music that spoke of loss and longing, of beauty found in sorrow, of the human soul's capacity to endure. Every note carried the weight of her own experience, the grief she had never been permitted to express openly, now finding voice through Beethoven's genius. The room had fallen absolutely silent. Even those who had been paying minimal attention to the previous performances now listened with complete focus. The music seemed to lay bare something essential, stripping away the veneer of polite society to reveal raw feeling beneath. It was Lord Adrian who watched most intently. He had been standing near the fireplace, maintaining his usual stance of polite but distant interest, when the first note sounded. Something in the music had caught him, held him, demanded his complete attention. He found himself moving closer to the pianoforte, drawn by a performance unlike any he had heard in years. This was not a young lady displaying her accomplishments for potential suitors. This was an artist speaking through her instrument, communicating truths that words could never express. Yet it was not merely the technical brilliance that arrested him, impressive though it was. It was the familiar language of loss woven into every phrase, the understanding of grief that could only come from having lived through it. The music spoke of sorrow born with dignity, of beauty found in darkness, of the soul's capacity to endure when all seemed lost. It echoed his own 4 years of mourning, his own carefully buried pain, making him feel understood in a way he had not felt since Eleanor's death. In that moment, he did not see a servant performing at her mistress's command. He saw a soul that spoke the same silent dialect of suffering as his own, and the recognition struck him with unexpected force. As Isabella reached the Adagio cantabile, the slow movement that formed the heart of the sonata, Lord Adrian found himself studying the performer with an intensity that surprised him. Her posture was perfect, her concentration absolute. But it was her face that held him, the way her features reflected the music's emotional journey, the slight tension around her eyes suggesting barely suppressed pain, the set of her mouth speaking of determined dignity in the face of sorrow. Who was this woman? How had a mere companion acquired such skill, such depth of musical understanding? And why did her playing move him in a way nothing had moved him since Eleanor's death? The final movement, the rondo, brought the performance to its conclusion with a surge of energy that nonetheless retained the underlying melancholy of the earlier movements. Isabella's fingers flew across the keys, executing the rapid passages with precision whilst maintaining the emotional through line that gave the piece its coherence. When the final chord sounded, she sat for a moment with her hands still on the keys, as though reluctant to break the spell the music had woven. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. Then applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic, quite unlike the polite acknowledgement that had greeted the previous performers. Several gentlemen called out their appreciation, and even the most jaded members of the ton found themselves applauding with real feeling. Lady Constance looked torn between pride at her companion's evident talent and irritation at the attention being lavished upon a servant. She rose quickly, moving to the pianoforte to deflect some of the praise to herself, as though Isabella's performance reflected primarily upon her own excellent taste in hiring such an accomplished companion. Isabella stood and moved away from the instrument, attempting to fade back into her corner. But she found her path blocked by Lord Adrian, who had approached with the sort of quiet determination that suggested he would not be easily dissuaded. One must confess that the Marquess possessed the sort of presence that made simple proximity feel significant. He stood before Isabella, studying her with an intensity that made her acutely uncomfortable. She kept her eyes lowered, as befitted her station, but she could feel his gaze upon her face as though it were a physical touch. The Marquess did not speak immediately. He seemed to be weighing his words, considering how to phrase a question that clearly troubled him. When he finally did speak, his voice proved as striking as his appearance, deep and cultured, with an underlying warmth that his reserved manner could not entirely conceal. He remarked upon the exceptional quality of her performance, noting that such skill spoke of years of dedicated study under an excellent master. He observed that Beethoven's works required not merely technical proficiency, but genuine understanding of musical architecture and emotional expression. Then he asked, with careful courtesy, where she had received her training. Isabella felt panic rise in her throat. This was precisely the sort of attention she could not afford. Any detailed questioning about her background risked exposure. She murmured something vague about having been fortunate in her governesses, keeping her responses brief and deferential. She attempted to move away, to return to her designated obscurity, but Lord Adrian shifted slightly, maintaining his position between her and retreat. He commented that her accent suggested education far beyond what most companions possessed. He noted the quality of her French when she had responded in that language to a passing remark from the Dowager Duchess. He observed that her bearing, despite the humble circumstances in which she found herself, spoke of breeding and refinement. Isabella felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. She mumbled an excuse about needing to attend to Lady Constance and attempted once more to escape. This time Lord Adrian allowed her to pass, but she could feel his eyes following her across the room. She knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that the Marquess had seen something in her that others had missed. He had recognized, however dimly, that she was not what she appeared to be. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of anxiety. Isabella performed her duties mechanically, her mind racing with worry. Had she revealed too much through her performance? Would Lord Adrian pursue his questioning? What would happen if her true identity were discovered? The questions circled endlessly, offering no comfort, no easy answers. It was past midnight when the last guests departed. Lady Constance, flushed with the success of her entertainment, and perhaps also with rather too much champagne, dismissed Isabella with a wave of her hand. The companion climbed the stairs to her small room in the servants' quarters, her feet aching and her mind exhausted. She prepared for bed mechanically, but sleep proved elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lord Adrian's penetrating gaze, felt the weight of his scrutiny, and feared what the consequences might be of having attracted his attention. The days following the musical soirée brought no relief from Isabella's anxiety. Indeed, her fears seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Lady Constance had been in unusually high spirits, crowing about the success of her entertainment and the attendance of such notable figures as the Marquess of Ravencrest and his mother. She had received a gratifying number of morning calls from ladies eager to maintain the connection, and the on dit throughout the ton suggested that the Hartleys were rising in social estimation. Isabella had hoped that Lord Adrian's interest would prove momentary, a passing curiosity that would fade once he returned to his usual pursuits. Instead, the weeks that followed unfolded in a pattern both torturous and inescapable. There was a glance exchanged across the theater boxes during a performance of Don Giovanni, his gray eyes finding hers in the darkness before she could look away. A formal bow during a promenade in Hyde Park, where his acknowledgement seemed directed more toward her than toward Lady Constance, drawing curious stares from those who noticed. An encounter at Hatchard's, where he appeared beside her as she examined a translation of Dante, making observations about Italian literature that forced her to respond or appear deliberately rude. Each meeting increased the danger of exposure, each moment of his attention a weight upon her carefully maintained disguise. The Marquess's persistent regard did not go unnoticed. Lady Constance observed with an expression mixing suspicion and calculation, already scheming how to exploit this unexpected development to her own advantage. And Isabella, caught between fear of discovery and something she refused to name, found herself thinking far too often of gray eyes and a voice that spoke to her as though she were still a lady rather than a servant. It was this scheming that led to Isabella's next significant encounter with the Marquess. Lady Constance had finagled an invitation to a garden party at the Dowager Duchess's residence in Richmond. The event was small by ton standards, limited to perhaps 50 guests, but exceptionally select. To be included suggested a level of social acceptance that Lady Constance craved desperately. The gardens at Richmond Park House were legendary. 3 generations of Dukes of Northmoor had devoted time and considerable expense to creating a landscape that rivaled the finest estates in England. Sweeping lawns gave way to carefully designed wilderness areas. Classical statuary dotted the grounds. A stream had been dammed to create a picturesque lake, complete with a small island accessed by an ornamental bridge. Isabella accompanied Lady Constance through the grounds, carrying her mistress's parasol and shawl, attending to every whim. But when Lady Constance became absorbed in conversation with several other ladies near the main lawn, she dismissed Isabella with a wave, instructing her to wait by the rose garden until summoned. Isabella welcomed the respite. She made her way to the designated area, a secluded spot where climbing roses covered an elaborate trellis structure. The scent was overwhelming, the visual effect stunning. She sat on a stone bench, allowing herself a rare moment of peace, breathing in the perfume of thousands of blooms and trying not to think about her mother's rose garden at Ashbourne, long since neglected by the property's new owners. She was so lost in memory that she did not hear approaching footsteps. When a shadow fell across her, she looked up in alarm to find Lord Adrian standing before her, apparently as surprised by the encounter as she was. The Marquess asked whether he disturbed her solitude. Isabella immediately rose, offering to withdraw so that he might enjoy the garden in privacy. But Lord Adrian raised a hand, requesting that she remain. He seated himself at the opposite end of the bench, maintaining proper distance whilst making clear his intention to converse. What followed was the most extended conversation Isabella had yet had with the Marquess. The gardens, Lord Adrian explained, had been his grandmother's particular passion, her devotion to roses matched only by his own appreciation for landscapes designed to appear natural whilst actually representing careful artifice. His art collection included a painting by Claude Lorrain, he mentioned, that depicted an idealized landscape not unlike the view from where they sat. Music became their next topic, and his deep knowledge of composition and theory revealed an engagement that went far beyond the typical aristocrat's polite interest. Through all of this, he asked questions. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that could be considered overly personal. Yet each inquiry seemed designed to draw out information about Isabella's background, her education, her thoughts on various subjects. She answered carefully, revealing as little as possible whilst trying not to appear deliberately evasive. But the effort exhausted her. Maintaining her facade whilst engaging with someone as perceptive as the Marquess proved enormously draining. At one point, there was about her, Lord Adrian observed quietly, a quality of profound sadness. She seemed to carry a great burden of loss, as though she had once possessed something precious that had been taken from her. His voice held genuine concern when he wondered whether she had suffered some great tragedy. Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes. The kindness in his tone, the empathy in his words, threatened to break down the walls she had so carefully maintained. She wanted, with a desperation that frightened her, to tell him everything, to explain about her father's ruin, her mother's death, the impossible choice she had made to protect her brother's future, to share the burden of her secret with someone who might understand. But she could not. To reveal her identity would be to risk everything she had sacrificed so much to protect. She murmured something vague about all lives containing sorrows, about the importance of bearing difficulties with grace. Then she rose, claiming that Lady Constance would be expecting her, and fled before her fragile composure could shatter completely. Lord Adrian watched her go, his expression troubled. He had seen the tears she fought to suppress, witnessed the battle between what she wanted to say and what she dared reveal. Something was very wrong in Miss Thornton's circumstances, something that went beyond mere poverty or reduced circumstances. And he found himself determined to discover what that something was. May brought warmer weather and an intensification of the social season. Almack's held its weekly assemblies, drawing the cream of society to its deliberately plain rooms. The patronesses wielded their power with ruthless efficiency, granting or denying vouchers based on criteria that seemed arbitrary to outsiders, but made perfect sense within the Byzantine logic of the ton. Lady Constance had achieved the coveted vouchers through a combination of persistence and Sir Reginald's financial generosity to certain causes favored by the patronesses. She attended the Wednesday assemblies with religious devotion, determined to solidify her position among the elite. And as her companion, Isabella was required to accompany her. Almack's represented a special torture for Isabella. Here, more than anywhere else, she encountered people she had known in her former life. The rooms had once been as familiar to her as her own drawing room. She had danced here as Lady Isabella Thornfield, standing up for the quadrille with eligible gentlemen, chatting with other young ladies about fashion and beau, taking for granted the acceptance that was her birthright. Now she stood against the wall with the chaperones and companions, watching others dance, invisible to the very people who had once competed for her attention. She saw Lady Henrietta Dalton, who had been a particular friend before the catastrophe. She observed Mr. Charles Riverton, who had once shown every sign of wishing to court her. She watched them all move through the evening without a single glance in her direction, as though she were a ghost haunting her own past. It was during one of these Wednesday assemblies that the incident occurred which would change everything. Lady Constance, emboldened by champagne and her recent social successes, had conceived a particularly cruel entertainment. She announced loudly to her circle of acquaintances that her companion would demonstrate a new country dance that was all the rage in Paris. Isabella would perform both the gentlemen's and ladies' parts, she explained with a laugh, since it would hardly be appropriate for Miss Thornton to actually dance with a gentleman. The suggestion was calculated humiliation. To expect a companion to dance alone, demonstrating steps for the amusement of her betters, reduced her to the status of a performing animal. Several of the ladies tittered, whilst others looked uncomfortable. But Lady Constance insisted, and Isabella knew she had no choice. To refuse would mean dismissal, and dismissal would mean losing her wages, her position, her ability to help Thomas. She moved to the center of the floor as indicated, feeling the eyes of the entire assembly upon her. She could hear whispers, see pointing, sense the mixture of amusement and discomfort her presence created. She prepared to begin the humiliating performance, calling upon every ounce of dignity she possessed to carry her through. But before she could take the first step, a voice cut through the whispers. Lord Adrian, who had been standing near the card room with several other gentlemen, stepped forward with the sort of quiet authority that silenced all conversation. He announced that if a demonstration was required, it should be performed properly, with both roles represented as they would be in actual dancing. He extended his hand to Isabella, making clear his intention to partner her. The room fell absolutely silent. For a gentleman of Lord Adrian's rank to dance with a lady's companion was unprecedented. Several of the patronesses looked scandalized. Lady Constance appeared torn between delight at the attention her companion was receiving and fury at being upstaged. The Dowager Duchess, present in her capacity as one of the senior members of society, watched with an expression of surprised approval. Isabella stood frozen, uncertain how to respond. To accept would draw even more attention to her, increase the risk of discovery. To refuse would insult a Marquess before the entire ton. She stood paralyzed by impossible choices. Lord Adrian solved her dilemma by simply taking her hand and leading her to the proper position. The musicians, receiving a nod from one of the patronesses, began to play, and Isabella found herself dancing at Almack's, not as Lady Isabella Thornfield making her debut, but as Miss Belle Thornton being treated like a lady by a Marquess who saw what others refused to acknowledge. The dance was a cotillion, requiring interaction and coordination between partners. Lord Adrian proved an excellent dancer, his movements precise yet fluid, his lead clear without being overwhelming. He guided Isabella through the figures with the sort of careful attention one might give to a duchess rather than a companion. As they danced, he spoke quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. He observed that Lady Constance's behavior had been unconscionable, that no lady should be subjected to such public humiliation. He noted that Isabella had borne the insult with remarkable grace, but that grace should not require bearing such treatment. He suggested with careful delicacy that there might be other situations available to a woman of her evident quality, positions that would offer greater dignity and respect. Isabella could not respond as she wished. They were surrounded by observers. Any lengthy conversation would be remarked upon. But she allowed herself to look fully at Lord Adrian for the first time, meeting his grey eyes with her own. In that moment, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of mutual understanding, a recognition of shared loss, and hidden depths. She saw in his face not pity, but respect, not condescension, but genuine regard. And she felt her carefully guarded heart crack just a little, letting in a ray of light she had thought forever extinguished. The dance ended. Lord Adrian bowed over her hand with the same courtesy he would show to a princess. Then he escorted her back to where Lady Constance stood, delivered Isabella to her mistress with impeccable propriety, and walked away without another word. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, had been done. The entire assembly had witnessed a Marquess treating a companion as though she were a lady of rank. The whispers began immediately. Who was this mysterious Miss Thornton? What was her history? Why would Lord Adrian show such marked attention to a woman in service? Lady Constance, sensing opportunity in the speculation, began to hint at mysterious connections, suggesting that her companion came from a family that had fallen on temporary difficulties. She implied knowledge she did not possess, dropping suggestions that Isabella's background was far more interesting than anyone suspected. The strategy was designed to increase Lady Constance's own consequence by association, but it had the unintended effect of making Isabella the subject of intense scrutiny. Over the following days, several ladies made pointed remarks during morning calls, fishing for information about Miss Thornton's background. Gentlemen who would normally never notice a companion now looked at Isabella with speculative interest. And worst of all, one particular gentleman began to pay very close attention indeed. Mr. Leonard Blackwell had been avoiding society for several years, his reputation as a schemer and fraudster making him unwelcome in respectable houses. But he maintained connections in less savory circles, keeping apprised of gossip and scandal. When word reached him of Lord Adrian's attention to a certain Miss Belle Thornton, companion to Lady Constance Hartley, something about the description nagged at him. He made inquiries. He observed from a distance during a promenade in Hyde Park, and when he finally got a clear look at Miss Thornton's face, recognition struck him like a physical blow. Lady Isabella Thornfield was alive and living in London under an assumed name. The daughter of the man he had swindled, the young woman who had been present during some of his discussions with her father, who might possibly have knowledge that could link him to the fraud that had destroyed the Earl of Ashbourne. She represented a threat he had thought safely eliminated by poverty and exile. Her presence in London, her growing visibility thanks to Lord Adrian's attention, made her a danger he could not ignore. Blackwell began to formulate a plan. He would approach Lady Isabella, Miss Thornton, and make his position clear. She would become his mistress, providing him with the protection of a connection to the Marquess of Ravencrest whilst ensuring her silence about the past. If she refused, he would expose her identity, reveal her deception, and destroy any possibility of her brother reclaiming respectability. It was a simple choice: submit to his demands or see everything she had sacrificed for collapse in ruins. He began to watch her, learning her habits, waiting for the right moment to approach. And Isabella, absorbed in her own confusion about Lord Adrian's interest and what it might mean, remained unaware that a far more immediate danger was stalking her through London's streets. The approach came on an afternoon in early June. Isabella had been sent to collect fabric samples from a mercer's establishment on Bond Street, one of her regular errands. She had completed her task and was walking back toward Berkeley Square when she became aware of someone matching her pace. She increased her speed. The follower did the same. When she glanced back, she saw a gentleman in a dark coat, his hat pulled low, maintaining his position some 20 yards behind her. Fear clutched at Isabella's heart. She turned onto a less crowded side street, hoping to lose her pursuer, but this proved a mistake. The man moved more quickly, closing the distance between them. When she tried to run, he called out her name, her real name, the one no one in London was supposed to know. Lady Isabella Thornfield. The syllables stopped her in her tracks more effectively than any physical barrier. She turned slowly to face the speaker, and recognition sent ice through her veins. Leonard Blackwell, the man who had destroyed her father, who had taken everything from her family, now stood before her wearing an expression of oily triumph. Blackwell wasted no time on pleasantries. He stated baldly that he knew who she was, that her deception could not stand scrutiny, that one word from him would destroy her brother's chances forever. Thomas Thornfield, son of a disgraced Earl, might just manage to make his way in the world if his sister were believed dead or safely abroad. But Thomas Thornfield, brother to a woman who had deceived society by working as a servant under a false name, would be finished before he began. Isabella found her voice, demanding to know what Blackwell wanted. The answer proved even worse than she had feared. He wanted her, in every sense that phrase implied. She would become his mistress, meeting him as he directed, providing him with the physical intimacy he desired and the social protection afforded by her connection to Lord Adrian. In return, he would keep her secret, allow her brother to continue his education unmolested, and perhaps even provide limited financial assistance. The proposal was delivered with such casual confidence, as though Blackwell had no doubt she would accept, that Isabella felt fury rise above her fear. She told him, with all the cold aristocratic hauteur she had been suppressing for 2 years, precisely what he could do with his proposal. She informed him that she would rather die than submit to his demands, that she would rather see her deception exposed than allow him to touch her, that she would go to the authorities herself and testify to his fraudulent dealings before she would become his whore. Blackwell's expression turned ugly. He stepped closer, close enough that Isabella could smell the pomade in his hair and the stale wine on his breath. He informed her that she was in no position to make threats. He had been careful to leave no evidence linking himself to the South American mining fraud. Her father had been too trusting, too eager to believe in promised riches, to insist on proper documentation. Any accusation she made would be dismissed as the desperate lies of a ruined family seeking revenge. But her exposure as an impostor, he continued with vicious satisfaction, would be believed immediately. The Tun loved nothing more than a scandal involving deception and fallen aristocrats. She would be ostracized, vilified, made into a cautionary tale for ambitious servants who presumed above their station. And her brother, poor young Thomas, would find every door in respectable society closed to him forever. Isabella felt ice settle into her veins, transforming terror into something harder and more dangerous. She drew herself up to her full height, every inch the Earl's daughter despite her worn gown and years of servitude. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the cold precision of true aristocracy, the kind that could not be purchased or imitated. She informed Blackwell that he might indeed destroy her name, expose her deception, ruin her brother's prospects. But he labored under a fundamental misunderstanding if he believed such threats would bend her to his will. Her name was the one thing he could never purchase, no matter what power he wielded. Her honor was not for sale at any price. She would rather face society's condemnation with her integrity intact than preserve her position through submission to a man whose very touch would defile her. Blackwell's face darkened with fury at her defiance, but he forced himself to smile, a twisted expression devoid of warmth. Very well, he conceded with false magnanimity. He would give her 3 days to reconsider, to contemplate what her pride would cost her brother. They would meet again, in the same location, and she would provide her final answer. He suggested she think carefully about young Thomas's future, about the alternative of exposure and ruin. Then he departed, leaving Isabella shaking with a combination of terror and rage, but with her dignity intact. She returned to Berkeley Square in a state of emotional chaos. Her mind raced through possibilities, seeking some solution, some escape from the impossible trap that had closed around her. She could not, would not submit to Blackwell's demands, but neither could she see any way to protect Thomas if the truth were revealed. That evening, Lady Constance was hosting a small dinner party. Isabella was required to attend, hovering in the background, ready to assist as needed. But her distraction was evident, her usual composed efficiency notably absent. She dropped a wine glass while attempting to refill a gentleman's drink. She forgot to fetch Lady Constance's shawl when requested. She stood staring into space when she should have been attending to duties. Lord Adrian was among the dinner guests. He noticed immediately that something was amiss with Miss Thornton. She appeared pale, abstracted, clearly distressed despite her attempts to maintain normal demeanor. He observed her with growing concern, wishing he could speak with her privately, but knowing such a conversation would be impossible under the circumstances. After dinner, as the gentlemen lingered over port, whilst the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, Lord Adrian made a decision. He excused himself earlier than was customary, claiming a pressing engagement elsewhere. But rather than departing the house, he waited in the hallway, hoping for an opportunity to speak with Miss Thornton privately. Fortune granted his wish. Isabella had been sent to the library to fetch a book of poetry Lady Constance wished to show her guests. Lord Adrian followed, catching her as she stood before the shelves, staring blankly at titles without actually seeing them. He spoke her name, Miss Thornton, and she startled violently, spinning to face him with an expression of such fear that it alarmed him. He apologized immediately for frightening her, noting that she seemed greatly distressed and wondering whether there was anything he might do to assist her. Isabella wanted desperately to confide in him. The temptation to share her burden, to ask for his help, nearly overwhelmed her. But how could she explain without revealing everything? How could she tell him about Blackwell's threats without admitting her deception, her true identity, the complete fabrication her life had become? She began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face, her composure finally cracking under the accumulated weight of fear and isolation. Lord Adrian, moved by her distress, reached out instinctively, his hand touching her shoulder in a gesture meant to comfort. But this innocent touch, witnessed by a passing servant, would become the seed of misunderstanding that would drive them apart. The servant, eager to curry favor with Lady Constance, reported what she had seen. Miss Thornton alone in the library with Lord Adrian, the Marquess touching her intimately, Miss Thornton crying. Lady Constance, who received this intelligence the following morning, drew her own conclusions. Her companion had been attempting to seduce the Marquess, using tears and manipulation to engage his sympathies. The ambition of it, the deception, the presumption, all confirmed Lady Constance's worst suspicions about servants who grew too proud. Lady Constance confronted Isabella with cold fury. She announced that Miss Thornton's employment was terminated immediately. She would not tolerate a companion who engaged in inappropriate behavior with guests, who used emotional manipulation to attract gentlemen above her station. Isabella was given 1 hour to pack her belongings and vacate the premises. Isabella tried to explain, to defend herself against accusations she barely understood, but Lady Constance refused to listen. The dismissal stood. Isabella found herself in the street with her small trunk, her meager savings, and nowhere to go. She took a room at a modest boarding house in an unfashionable district, spending her first night of homelessness trying to formulate some plan, any plan that might save her and Thomas from the ruin that seemed inevitable. She considered briefly seeking help from the magistrates at Bow Street. Blackmail was a crime, after all. But the thought died before it could fully form. Any investigation, even if the authorities believed her accusations, would require revealing every detail of her life under an assumed name. The legal proceedings themselves would expose her as thoroughly as Blackwell's threats, dragging her deception into public scrutiny and destroying Thomas's future just as effectively. There was no legal recourse that did not lead to the same ruinous end. She was trapped, caught between impossible choices, with no escape visible in any direction. What Isabella did not know was that Lord Adrian, learning of her dismissal through his mother's network of informants, had drawn entirely the wrong conclusion. The Dowager Duchess had heard a garbled version of events suggesting that Miss Thornton had been caught in a compromising situation with a gentleman, though his name was not mentioned, and had been dismissed for moral failings. Lord Adrian, unaware that he himself was the gentleman in question and that the situation had been entirely innocent, assumed that Miss Thornton had been involved with someone else, someone who had taken advantage of her vulnerable position. He felt betrayed, though he had no right to such feelings. The pain that lanced through him at the news of her disgrace revealed a truth he had been denying. He had been falling in love with the mysterious companion, drawn to her quiet dignity, her hidden sorrow, her evident quality despite her reduced circumstances. Yet even as his heart protested, the injustice of condemning her unheard, his mind seized upon the narrative of betrayal with a desperate eagerness that shamed him. Was this not exactly what he had been expecting? Had he not learned from Eleanor's death that hope was the cruelest master, that allowing oneself to care was merely an invitation to future devastation? Part of him, the wounded, scarred part that had not healed in 4 years, almost welcomed this confirmation that he had been right to guard his heart, right to resist the dangerous pull of renewed feeling. He withdrew into cold anger, retreating behind the walls he had built after Eleanor's death, telling himself he had been a fool to believe Miss Thornton might be different. The performance of propriety had been merely that, a performance designed to attract a wealthy protector. He had been fortunate, he assured himself without conviction, to discover the truth before allowing his feelings to progress further. Yet beneath the anger lay something darker and more painful. The knowledge that he was using this supposed betrayal as armor against vulnerability, preferring the familiar ache of cynicism to the terrifying possibility of hope. Both Isabella and Lord Adrian spent the next several days in misery, each believing the other had betrayed or abandoned them, neither knowing the truth of the misunderstanding that separated them, and neither aware that Leonard Blackwell waited with malicious patience for Isabella's answer, ready to destroy her if she refused his demands. The 3 days Blackwell had granted passed with agonizing slowness. Isabella spent them in her boarding house room, trying to formulate some response that might buy more time or find some solution to the impossible dilemma. She considered writing to Lord Adrian, explaining everything, asking for his help, but her pride would not allow it. She had worked too hard to maintain her independence, sacrificed too much to preserve her dignity, to throw herself on the mercy of a man she barely knew, no matter how kind he had seemed. She considered fleeing London entirely, taking Thomas from his school and disappearing into obscurity somewhere in the north of England. But where would they go? How would they live? Her savings would last perhaps 2 months if they were very careful. And such flight would confirm any accusations Blackwell might make, destroying Thomas's reputation as effectively as any exposure. The 3rd evening arrived, bringing with it the deadline for her response. Isabella dressed with care in her one good gown, a dark blue muslin that had seen better days but remained respectable. She pinned her hair severely back, as though armor might be found in perfect grooming. Then she made her way to the designated meeting place on Bond Street, determined to refuse Blackwell's demands regardless of consequences. But Providence, it seemed, had finally tired of testing her endurance. For Lord Adrian had spent those same 3 days investigating the circumstances of Miss Thornton's dismissal. Something about the story had not rung true to him. He knew his own actions in the library had been entirely innocent. Why then had she been dismissed? What exactly had been witnessed, and by whom? Through careful inquiry and a judicious payment to the servant who had reported the incident, he learned the truth. There had been no improper liaison, no attempt at seduction, simply a distressed young woman crying and a gentleman attempting to offer comfort. The interpretation had been Lady Constance's, colored by jealousy and spite. This revelation sent Lord Adrian down a new path of investigation. If Lady Constance had been so ready to believe the worst of her companion, perhaps there was more to the situation than he had understood. He began to dig into Miss Thornton's background more thoroughly, using resources available to a man of his wealth and position. He hired a discreet inquiry agent to trace her history. What the agent discovered proved shocking. Miss Belle Thornton had appeared in London 2 years prior with no traceable history before that date. The name itself appeared to be false, or at least without any supporting documentation. But more interesting was what the agent learned through interviews with various servants and tradespeople. Miss Thornton had been observed being followed by a particular gentleman, One Mr. Leonard Blackwell, known to the agent as a suspected fraudster who had somehow evaded prosecution for various schemes. This intelligence sent Lord Adrian's thoughts in a new direction. He had his agent investigate Blackwell more thoroughly, and what emerged was damning. Evidence of the man's involvement in a fraudulent mining scheme several years prior, one that had ruined several aristocratic families, including the Earl of Ashbourne. The Earl of Ashbourne. The name resonated in Lord Adrian's memory. He recalled hearing of the man's death, the family's ruin, the disappearance of his surviving children from society. He remembered that the Earl had left a daughter and a son. The daughter would be of an age with Miss Thornton. Could it be possible? Lord Adrian requested information about the late Earl's daughter. Her name had been Isabella. She had been known for her musical accomplishments, her education, her grace. She had disappeared after her mother's death, presumed to have retired to relations in the country or perhaps abroad. But what if she had not fled? What if she had remained in London, hiding in plain sight under an assumed name, working to support her younger brother? Everything suddenly made sense. The quality of her education, her refined bearing, her knowledge of music and literature, even the sadness that seemed to cling to her. Miss Belle Thornton was Lady Isabella Thornfield, and Blackwell's attention suggested he knew it too, which meant Isabella was in danger. Lord Adrian immediately went in search of her. He tried the boarding house where she had taken a room, but the landlady informed him Miss Thornton had departed an hour prior. He remembered the agent's report of Blackwell following her on Bond Street. If she was meeting the blackmailer somewhere in that vicinity, he might yet intercept her. He drove his curricle through the streets with reckless speed, scanning the pedestrians, searching for Isabella's distinctive bearing. It was full dark now, the street lamps casting pools of golden light along the pavement. And there, in one such pool of light, he saw her, standing rigid and pale as Blackwell leaned close, speaking words Adrian could not hear but could well imagine. Isabella stood frozen as Blackwell delivered his ultimatum with vicious satisfaction. Submit to his demands, become his mistress, or watch as her deception was exposed to all of society. Her brother's future, Blackwell reminded her with cruel emphasis, hung in the balance. One word from him would destroy any chance Thomas had of reclaiming respectability. For a moment, Isabella felt the weight of impossibility press upon her. Then something shifted within her, a core of steel that 2 years of servitude had forged rather than broken. She drew herself up to her full height, every inch the Earl's daughter, despite her worn gown and reduced circumstances. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the cold precision of true aristocracy, the kind that could not be purchased or imitated. She informed Blackwell that he might indeed destroy her name, expose her deception, ruin her brother's prospects. But he labored under a fundamental misunderstanding if he believed such threats would bend her to his will. Her name was the one thing he could never purchase, no matter what power he wielded. Her honor remained her own, not for sale at any price. She would rather face society's condemnation with her integrity intact than preserve her position through submission to a man whose very touch would defile everything she valued. He might take everything from her, as he had taken everything from her father, but he would never possess what he most desired: power over her choices, dominion over her will, ownership of her person. She refused him absolutely, and if that refusal meant her destruction, then so be it. Some things remained worth more than survival. Blackwell's face contorted with rage at her defiance. He raised his hand. Whether to strike her or seize her, Isabella could not tell. But before violence could follow threat, the sharp clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the rattle of wheels announced an arrival that would change everything. He brought his curricle to a halt directly beside them, startling both Isabella and Blackwell. He descended without waiting for his tiger to secure the horses, addressing Blackwell with cold fury. He informed the fraudster that he knew exactly who he was, what he had done, and what he was attempting to do now. He revealed that he had spent the past 3 days gathering evidence of Blackwell's crimes, including testimony from other victims of the mining scheme. He had already spoken with a magistrate and had warrants prepared. Blackwell, faced with exposure and prosecution, attempted to bluster. He claimed that Isabella was an impostor, that she had deceived society, that her own deception was as criminal as anything he might have done. But Lord Adrian cut him off with devastating precision. He announced that Lady Isabella Thornfield had done nothing illegal. Assuming a different name for employment was not a crime. Working honestly to support oneself was admirable. If she had concealed her identity, it was to protect her brother's reputation, not to perpetrate fraud. Moreover, Lord Adrian continued, his voice ringing with authority, if Blackwell uttered one word against Lady Isabella, if he so much as breathed her name in public, the full weight of the Sutherland family influence would descend upon him. Lord Adrian would see him prosecuted for fraud, see him imprisoned, see him utterly destroyed. And given the evidence already collected, given the testimony of multiple victims prepared to testify, the outcome of such prosecution was certain. Blackwell saw his defeat written in Lord Adrian's implacable expression. He tried one last desperate gambit, suggesting that Lord Adrian's own reputation would suffer if he associated with a woman who had worked as a servant. But the Marquess dismissed this with contempt. Lady Isabella had done what was necessary to survive and to protect her family. Anyone who condemned her for such courage and determination was not worth consideration. Blackwell, recognizing that he had lost completely, slunk away into the darkness, leaving Isabella and Lord Adrian alone on the street. Isabella stood frozen, overwhelmed by the speed of events, by having her carefully guarded secret revealed, by the magnitude of Lord Adrian's intervention on her behalf. Lord Adrian spoke her name, her true name, Lady Isabella, with infinite gentleness. He apologized for not discovering the truth sooner, for allowing her to suffer alone, for the misunderstanding that had caused them both pain. He explained what he had learned, how he had spent the past days gathering evidence against Blackwell, how he had been searching for her to warn her of danger. Isabella found her voice at last. She asked how he had discovered her identity.
Lord Adrian explained his investigation, his deductions, his certainty even before confirmation that Miss Thornton was someone extraordinary hiding in plain sight. He told her that he understood why she had concealed her background, that he admired her courage in choosing honest work over charity, that her brother was fortunate to have such a devoted sister. Then he did something unexpected.
He admitted that he had been falling in love with her, that his interest had never been mere curiosity, that he had recognized in her a kindred spirit bearing loss with dignity. He acknowledged that his feelings were perhaps premature, perhaps unwelcome, but he could not remain silent about them any longer. Isabella felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different from the tears of despair she had shed before. These were tears of relief, of overwhelming gratitude, of something that might have been joy if she had dared to embrace it. She confessed that she had been drawn to him as well, that his kindness had been a light in her darkness, that she had forced herself to resist her feelings because she could not see any possible future for them. Lord Adrian took her hands in his, holding them gently despite the impropriety of such contact on a public street. He told her that he saw a future very clearly. He wished to restore her to her rightful position in society. He wanted to ensure her brother received the education and opportunities due to the son of an Earl. And if she were willing, he hoped eventually to make her his wife, his Marchioness, his partner in life. Isabella could hardly believe what she was hearing. After 2 years of struggle, of loneliness, of grinding fear, suddenly everything was changing. But years of hardship had made her cautious. She pointed out that society would condemn him for marrying someone who had worked as a servant, that his family would object, that the scandal would be enormous. Lord Adrian smiled, the first truly warm smile Isabella had seen from him. He informed her that he cared nothing for society's opinion, that his mother had already expressed approval of her son's interest in the mysterious Miss Thornton. That scandal was temporary whilst love endured. He promised that he would handle any social consequences, protect her from gossip, ensure her acceptance among the ton. But first, he continued, there was someone else who needed to know the truth. They would call upon the Duke of Northmoor the following day, Lord Adrian's father, and explain the full circumstances. With the Duke's support, which Lord Adrian felt certain would be forthcoming, Isabella's restoration to her proper station would be assured. Then they could proceed properly, with courtship conducted according to all conventions, leading to a wedding that would demonstrate to all of society that Lady Isabella Thornfield was a woman of honor, deserving of respect and admiration. The following day brought events that Isabella would remember for the rest of her life. Lord Adrian arrived at her boarding house mid-morning, accompanied by his mother, the Dowager Duchess. The older lady swept into Isabella's modest room with all the grandeur of a queen entering a palace, then surprised Isabella completely by embracing her warmly and calling her my dear child. The Dowager Duchess explained that her son had told her everything. She declared that Isabella's conduct had been not merely acceptable, but admirable. To sacrifice one's pride, to work honestly for one's living, to protect a younger sibling at cost to oneself, these were the actions of a true lady. The Dowager Duchess announced that she would be proud to call Isabella daughter, assuming, of course, that the girl was sensible enough to accept Adrian's suit when properly offered. From the boarding house, they proceeded to Northmoor House, the London residence of the Duke of Northmoor. Isabella felt her anxiety rise as they approached the imposing mansion. The Duke was known as a man of rigid principles and exacting standards. Would he truly accept his son's choice of a disgraced Earl's daughter who had worked as a servant? The Duke received them in his library, a room lined with volumes collected over generations. He was a tall man in his 7th decade, with the same gray eyes as his son and a bearing that commanded instant respect. He listened without interruption as Lord Adrian explained the full circumstances. Isabella's identity, the fraud that had ruined her father, her decision to work as a companion, Blackwell's attempted blackmail, and his own intervention. When Lord Adrian finished, silence filled the library. The Duke studied Isabella with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He pronounced that the Earl of Ashbourne had been a friend of his youth, an honorable man destroyed by a scoundrel's deception. He declared that the Earl's daughter, in choosing honest work over charity, had demonstrated the very qualities that made the aristocracy worthy of their position. She had nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of. Moreover, the Duke continued, he had been concerned for some years about his son's withdrawn state. Adrian had buried himself in grief for far too long. If Lady Isabella could draw him back to life, restore his capacity for happiness, then she would be doing the family a service beyond measure. The Duke gave his blessing to a courtship, with the understanding that proper time would be allowed for the relationship to develop before any marriage was formalized. Then he fixed Isabella with a look that was both kind and formidable. He observed that some might question a Marquess marrying a lady who had worked in service, regardless of her true rank. Let them question, he stated with absolute certainty. The ton might whisper and speculate, but their opinions were merely wind against the immovable rock of ducal authority. The Sutherlands dictated what society accepted, not the reverse. If the Duke of Northmoor declared Lady Isabella Thornfield worthy of his son, then worthy she would be considered by anyone who valued their position in society. And those foolish enough to voice disapproval would find themselves on the wrong side of one of England's most powerful families. The Duke then addressed the practical matters with characteristic efficiency. He would personally sponsor Lady Isabella's re-entry into society. A ball would be held at Northmoor House to introduce her properly, with the Duke's endorsement making clear that she had his full support. He would ensure Thomas Thornfield was removed from the charity school and enrolled at Eton, with all expenses covered by the ducal purse. And he would launch a quiet investigation to recover what assets might remain from the Ashbourne estate, with an eye toward eventual restoration of the family properties to Thomas when he came of age. Isabella found herself overwhelmed by the Duke's generosity, yet she recognized this moment required not merely gratitude but active partnership. She had survived 2 years through careful strategy and quick thinking. Those skills, she realized, would serve her now. She thanked the Duke with genuine feeling, then ventured carefully into the delicate territory of practical planning. If His Grace would permit her to suggest, perhaps a gradual reintroduction to society might serve better than an immediate grand gesture. She might begin by appearing under the Dowager Duchess's sponsorship at smaller gatherings, allowing the Tun to grow accustomed to her presence before any formal ball. The whispers would spread regardless, but managing their progression might transform gossip from condemnation into curiosity, and curiosity eventually into acceptance. The Duke regarded her with new respect, a slight smile touching his austere features. He observed that Lady Isabella possessed not merely courage, but strategic intelligence, qualities that would serve her well as a future Marchioness. He accepted her suggestion, noting that she understood the Tun's dynamics better than he had credited. They would proceed as she recommended, with careful attention to timing and presentation. The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of activity. Isabella moved from her boarding house to a suite of rooms at Northmoor House, becoming an official guest of the ducal family. The Dowager Duchess took personal charge of replenishing Isabella's wardrobe, ensuring she possessed everything necessary for re-entry into society. The finest modistes were summoned, creating gowns suitable for a lady of rank. Jewels were selected from the family collection, pieces that had belonged to Lord Adrian's grandmother and were now offered to Isabella. Through all of this, Lord Adrian paid court with patient devotion. They took walks in the gardens, always properly chaperoned. They attended the opera, sitting in the ducal box where all could see them together. They rode in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, Lord Adrian on his bay gelding and Isabella on a gentle grey mare from the Northmoor stables. They conversed for hours about books and music, art and philosophy, discovering depths of compatibility that went far beyond mere attraction. Isabella also wrote to her brother, explaining in carefully chosen words that their circumstances had changed dramatically. She revealed her true identity, described Lord Adrian's assistance, and informed Thomas that he would be transferring to Eton at the start of the next term. The letter tried to convey both the joy and the unreality of their sudden change in fortune. Thomas's response arrived within days. His letter revealed the maturity that hardship had forced upon him. He expressed relief that his sister would no longer have to work, gratitude to Lord Adrian for his intervention, and a determination to prove himself worthy of the opportunities being offered. He asked whether it would be appropriate to call Lord Adrian brother, for it seemed clear that Isabella's feelings were deeply engaged and that marriage would be the eventual outcome. The ball at Northmoor House took place in late July, timed to occur just before society decamped to the country for summer. The guest list included the highest members of the Tun, carefully selected by the Duke to ensure maximum impact. Invitations were coveted, for an invitation to a Northmoor ball was a mark of favor not lightly granted. Isabella dressed for the evening with trembling hands. Her gown was white silk embroidered with silver thread, elegant without being ostentatious. Sapphires, a gift from the Dowager Duchess, adorned her throat and wrists. Her hair was dressed simply, as befitted her status as an unmarried lady, but with a silver ribbon woven through the curls that complemented the gown's embroidery. She descended the grand staircase to find Lord Adrian waiting in the hall. He wore evening dress of impeccable cut, his cravat arranged in an elaborate style that had taken his valet considerable effort to achieve. When he saw Isabella, his expression showed such open admiration, such unguarded affection, that several servants exchanged knowing smiles. The ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles. Flowers decorated every surface, their perfume filling the air. The cream of society assembled in their finest attire, jewels glittering, silks rustling, the collective wealth of England on display. As Isabella entered on Lord Adrian's arm, announced by the butler in ringing tones as Lady Isabella Thornfield, the room fell silent. The Duke stepped forward to greet his guests, making clear through his warm welcome that Lady Isabella enjoyed his complete approval. The Dowager Duchess embraced her publicly, a gesture that could not be misinterpreted. Then Lord Adrian led Isabella onto the floor for the first dance, a waltz, that most intimate of dances where couples actually held each other close. As they moved through the figures, Lord Adrian spoke quietly. He observed that she had been returned to the world she had left, restored to her proper place among society. But, he continued, he had one more restoration to effect. He wished to return to her something else she had lost, the possibility of happiness, of love, of a future built on mutual respect and affection. The music ended. The couples on the floor began to disperse, making way for the next set. But Lord Adrian remained in place, still holding Isabella's hand. The room grew quiet again as people realized something significant was about to occur. Lord Adrian released Isabella's hand, only to kneel before her on the polished parquet floor. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a ring, his family's signet ring, passed from father to son for 9 generations. He held it up, offering it to Isabella as hundreds of the Tun's most illustrious members watched in rapt attention. He spoke, and his voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. He addressed Isabella by her full name and title, acknowledging before all of society who she truly was. He recounted briefly the trials she had endured, the sacrifices she had made, the honor she had maintained through circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. He declared that she had lost her fortune, but never her integrity, lost her position, but never her dignity, been forced to serve others but had always remained a true lady. Then he asked, with humility that seemed impossible from a Marquess kneeling before an impoverished Earl's daughter, whether she would consent to become his wife, his Marchioness, his partner in all things. He promised to love her, honor her, protect her, and spend his life ensuring she never again knew hardship or fear. Isabella looked down at this man who had saved her from blackmail, restored her to society, offered her everything she had thought forever lost. She saw in his eyes the same quality she had recognized from their first meaningful encounter: the ability to see true worth regardless of circumstances, to value character over consequence, to love not what someone appeared to be, but who they actually were. She gave her answer in a voice that, while soft, carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. She accepted his proposal, pledged her own love in return, and promised to be worthy of the faith he had shown in her. She extended her hand, allowing him to slide the signet ring onto her finger, where it fit as though made for her. Lord Adrian rose and, before the entire assembly, kissed her hand with a reverence that made several ladies reach for their handkerchiefs. Then the room erupted in applause, genuine and enthusiastic, as society witnessed the conclusion of what was already being called the most romantic story of the decade. The remainder of the evening passed in celebration and congratulation. Former acquaintances greeted Lady Isabella with warmth, whilst Lady Constance's attempt at reconciliation was met with cool politeness that left no doubt as to her future standing. The transformation was complete. Isabella had been restored not just to her former position, but to something far greater. With the ring on her finger and the unwavering support of the Duke of Northmore, Isabella's restoration proved as swift as her fall had been devastating. Lord Adrian's investigation provided the evidence needed to see Leonard Blackwell prosecuted and transported to Australia. Justice finally served, though the stolen fortune could never be recovered. Lady Constance found her social ascent reversed, her cruelty remembered, and her invitations growing scarce until she faded into the obscurity she had so desperately tried to escape. The wedding that followed was intimate yet joyous, held in the Sutherland Chapel, with Thomas proudly giving his sister away. Lord Adrian kept every promise he had made, using his fortune to restore the Ashbourne estates for Thomas's eventual inheritance, and ensuring the young Earl received the education befitting his rank at Eton. But his greatest gift was simpler. He gave Isabella permission to be herself again, to reclaim not just her name, but her place in a world that had tried to forget her. In the years that followed, Isabella found unexpected joy in her role as Marchioness of Ravencrest. She established a charitable foundation to assist aristocratic families fallen on hard times, using her own experience to help others navigate reduced circumstances with dignity intact. Her musical talents, no longer hidden, brought beauty to private concerts at Northmoor House. And when she gave birth to healthy twin sons 18 months after her wedding, Lord Adrian wept with relief and joy, his long grief finally transformed into hope renewed. The story of the bankrupt Earl's daughter who worked as a servant but was recognized and elevated by a Marquess who saw her true worth became legendary among the ton. It was recounted for years as proof that genuine nobility resided in character rather than circumstance, that love could indeed conquer the strictest conventions of society when combined with courage and integrity. For Isabella and Lord Adrian, however, the story was simply their life, a testament to the truth that the heart knows its own value, that the soul recognizes its match, and that true love, once found, can overcome any obstacle that fate might place in its path.